تعيش أفغانستان واقعا مأزوما للغاية مع تقدم طالبان في ولايات عديدة، معارك ضارية تسفر بلا شك عن قتلى وجرحى. هذا عدا عما يعانيه الشعب الأفغاني جراء بطش طالبان. موقف طالبان بات واضحا، وهو الاستيلاء على السلطة في البلاد، ويمكن القول إن الشعب الأفغاني ترك وحيدا. إذن في خضم كل ذلك أردنا اليوم أن نسلط الضوء على الوضع الإنساني في أفغانستان. فهل ستنسحب المنظمات الأممية والإنسانية مع اكتمال انسحاب القوات الأمريكية وحلفائها بحلول 11 من سبتمبر المقبل؟ في حال بقيت المنظمات الأممية والدولية، كيف ستعمل في أفغانستان؟ ما هو عدد الضحايا الذين سقطوا حتى اليوم؟ أسئلة كثيرة نحملها اليوم إلى المتحدث الرسمي باسم مكتب الأمم المتحدة للشؤون الإنسانية يانس لارك. سيد يانس، بداية أهلا بك، تحدثنا مباشرة من جنيف. أهلا بك في أخبار الآن. سيد يانس، يعني اليوم بلا أي أدنى شك أن الشعب الأفغاني ترك وحيدا في هذه الظروف، ويعني يواجه مصيره إذا صح القول وحيدا. هل يمكن أو كيف يمكن وصف الوضع الإنساني في أفغانستان في البداية؟
Yes, first, thank you for having me on your show. The humanitarian situation in Afghanistan is increasingly dire, closing in, edging in on a catastrophic situation. What we have seen building up since May is a situation of massive displacement. Since May, we have on average 80,000 people displaced every month. We now estimate that half of the entire population in Afghanistan is in need of humanitarian assistance and protection. Nearly 1/3 of the people of Afghanistan are facing crisis or emergency levels of food insecurity, and half of the children need additional nutritional support. So the situation is indeed extremely concerning.
سيد يانس، يعني كلنا نعرف ماذا يجري في أفغانستان حاليا مع تقدم طالبان ومع هذه المعارك التي تجري في أفغانستان. كمنظمة متحدة وكمنظمات دولية، هل لديكم تقارير بشأن انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان التي يتم ارتكابها في أفغانستان في هذا الوقت الحالي؟
What we have heard from our human rights colleagues in the United Nations, and what we can see, our staff can see playing out every day, is that human rights are in a very bad shape at the moment. And we call really on all the parties to the conflict to protect the human rights of everybody. Now, in particular, women is a concern. There are being certain measures imposed on women in areas where the Taliban now has control. And we are concerned about that because it is a backsliding of the rights that women have little by little gained over the past years. So the human rights situation is as dire as the humanitarian situation. People both need food, water, shelter, protection, and they need, of course, to have their human rights respected.
ربما ما يهم الشعب الأفغاني اليوم هو التالي: أنه مع حلول 11 من سبتمبر تستكمل القوات الأمريكية وحلفاؤها الانسحاب من أفغانستان. أنتم كمنظمات أممية وإنسانية تابعة للأمم المتحدة، هل ستنسحبون من أفغانستان أم ستبقون تعملون هناك رغم كل ما يجري؟
The humanitarian and the United Nations presence in Afghanistan is purely civilian. We have all intention of staying and delivering aid and protection to the Afghan people. Our deal with Afghanistan is with the people of Afghanistan, with the civilians of Afghanistan. The United Nations has been in Afghanistan uninterrupted for about 70 years. And humanitarian organizations, right now there's more than 150 of them, both from the UN and the NGO community who are working across the country. We are committed to staying and helping the people who need it the most. That's women, it's children, but men as well. So that is our intention. Now, as we all know, fighting is moving every single day. today looks different from yesterday. Tomorrow will again look different. So we are looking at it every single day, and we are doing, of course, all we can in the circumstances. It's very important, two things. First of all, that the parties to the conflict understand that we need unhindered access to the people who need our assistance. And secondly, that they understand that civilians can never be targeted in conflict. So they are under obligation from international humanitarian law to protect the civilian population in their fighting.
سيد ينس، لنقول أنكم اضطررتم أو أجبرتم على مغادرة أفغانستان بسبب المعارك، بسبب خطورة ربما الوضع على الأرض في أفغانستان. في هذه الحالة كيف ستعملون كمنظمات أممية لمساعدة الشعب الأفغاني؟
First of all, absolutely. The Afghan people is in a very, very difficult situation. They are not being abandoned by the United Nations. They are not being abandoned by the many, many humanitarian organizations who are there, who have been there for a long time and who have all the intentions to stay and deliver aid. However, it's also clear from the developments that we see that the humanitarian and human rights situation is increasingly complicated and increasingly dire. And of course, we call on the international community. And there are many countries in the world who have some kind of influence over developments in Afghanistan, that they use their influence with all the parties to the conflict and put pressure on them so that we can reach a peaceful political settlement of the differences that are there. First and foremost, we need the guns to be silent. We need a ceasefire, and we need humanitarian access to the people who need it so that we can reach them with the food, water, sanitation, and protection that they need for their simple survival. We work with Afghans and have done for many, many years, I would say in two ways. First of all, the majority of UN staff is actually locally employed. So these are Afghan people who are working for the United Nations and other humanitarian organizations to help people in need. And the way we, to the best of our ability, try to help people is very much by engaging with the communities and asking them what it is they need, so that we get a locally informed answer to that question, what kind of aid do you want?
سيد ينس، هل هناك من تواصل اليوم كمنظمة متحدة مع طالبان لتجنب وقوع انتهاكات ربما أو ما شابه؟
Our colleagues from the Human Rights Officer and the Human Rights entity within the mission, the UN mission, which is civilian, that we have in Afghanistan, are having the contacts that they need to have in order to communicate any concerns that they have about the human rights situation in Afghanistan. From the humanitarian perspective, where we try to deliver aid to people, and that's a very practical, physical thing. We need, trucks to drive out. We need to be able to distribute relief. We also have conversations and dialogue with all the parties to the conflict. It's very important to understand that such communications are done purely for the purpose of reaching people in need. They do not mean that we acknowledge any political entity. They do not mean that we acknowledge that the fighting parties have a right to do what they do. It only means that we need to talk to those who have control over different areas in order to gain access to the civilians who need our assistance.
كمنظمة أممية، ما هي رسالة الأمم المتحدة إلى المجتمع الدولي؟ ما الذي يجب أن يفعله هذا المجتمع الدولي لمساعدة الشعب الأفغاني اليوم برأيك؟
I think there are two things we would like to say to the international community. First is that there are many countries, including countries in the region, neighboring countries, but also big powers of the world who have an influence and can exercise it. We are not talking about guns and bombs. We are talking about political and economic influence that they can use so that we reach a peaceful settlement for the benefit of the Afghan people who is suffering. So we urge them, use that influence now. If you have any, use it now, because now is the time. Secondly, on a more direct, practical level, we have a very large humanitarian operation going on in Afghanistan. That needs money, that needs resources. This year alone, we need about 1.3 billion US dollars. We are less than half funded of that. We can reach 16 million people across Afghanistan if we have the money. But we have a shortfall of $800 million. And that is one very practical, concrete way countries around the world can support the Afghan people. And that is through funding the appeal that we as humanitarians have out here, because then we can do our work and deliver the aid that people need.
سيد ينس، كمنظمة متحدة اليوم، هل لديكم أرقام عن عدد الضحايا الذين يسقطون في المعارك في أفغانستان أم لا؟
I have seen a report from the UN mission that says that at least 5,000 people, civilians, have been killed this year alone. It is very hard to make those calculations. In a conflict, as I'm sure you'll understand, like Afghanistan, not all deaths are recorded. People are, of course, being buried very, very quickly if they happen to be killed. So it's very difficult to get a concrete figure. Of course, we try our best to keep a tally, to keep an eye on those numbers. The number that we have, which is a bit more solid because that we can monitor better, is the number of people who are displaced. Of course, it is deeply tragic when people and civilians are killed in the course of fighting. That is deeply tragic. Us as humanitarian organizations, our job is to help those who survive and help those who are in humanitarian need. And many of those are being displaced from where they are. So when they get uprooted from their villages and homesteads, well, then they also lose their means of sustaining themselves when they become internally displaced. And there we have seen in the past 3 months about 80,000 people on average every month being displaced. And it's our job to try to help them.
هل يمكن القول اليوم أن أفغانستان تتجه إلى أن تكون معزولة عن دول العالم، ما عدا طبعا الدول التي تتواصل معها طالبان، وأقصد الصين وغير الصين أيضا؟ هل ستكون معزولة في هذه الحالة أم ماذا؟
Well, it is, of course, a concern that the conflict will have regional implications, that it will spill over into the region. So in that sense, it will not be isolated. We have seen already a trickle of a few hundred so far over the past weekend of Afghans seeking asylum in Iran. We, of course, urge all neighboring countries to keep their borders open so that those who are fleeing for their lives have access to a safe haven for the time being, at least. Whether it will be isolated, well, only the future can tell. But there is a political, if there is a political will in the world to help Afghanistan, then there are also the means. I mentioned there is countries who have influence over developments there, use that influence now. There's also a way to support the civilians inside Afghanistan through humanitarian aid. We have an appeal. Please fund that appeal because it does go to the right people.
المتحدث الرسمي باسم مكتب الأمم المتحدة يانس لاركي حدثنا من جنيف. شكرا جزيلا لك على هذه المقابلة.